Story 1. The Man in the Trees. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend. My friends and I had planned a camping trip to a secluded area in the woods, miles away from civilization. The forest was dense, with towering pines that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. We set up our tents near a small clearing by a stream, excited for a weekend of fishing, hiking, and stargazing. The first night was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I glanced into the forest, I thought I saw movement, just shadows shifting between the trees. My friends teased me, blaming it on my overactive imagination. The second night was different. As we sat around the campfire, sharing stories, we heard a faint rustling in the woods. At first, we thought it was just an animal, but the sound didn't fade. It moved closer, circling our campsite. One of my friends grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the noise, but there was nothing there. Then we saw him. A man stood just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the flickering firelight. He was tall and thin, wearing ragged clothes that hung off his frame. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes gleamed unnaturally in the dark. "Hello?" one of us called out, but he didn't respond. He just stood there watching. We debated whether to confront him or leave, but before we could decide, he stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. The forest fell silent, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. We spent the rest of the night huddled in our tents, too scared to sleep. The next morning we found footprints around our campsite, large, bare footprints. They circled our tents, coming as close as a few feet from where we had been sleeping. We packed up and left immediately, vowing never to return. To this day I can't explain who or what that man was. But I'll never forget the way his eyes seemed to pierce through the darkness, watching us like a predator stalking its prey. Story 2. The Whispering Lake. A group of us decided to camp by a remote lake deep in the mountains. The lake was stunning, surrounded by towering cliffs and dense forest. It was the kind of place that felt untouched by time, like stepping into another world. The first day was perfect. We swam in the crystal-clear water, roasted marshmallows over the campfire, and watched the stars reflect on the lake's surface. But as night fell, a strange sound broke the tranquility, a soft whispering coming from across the water. We tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the wind or the rustling of leaves. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like voices, multiple voices, speaking just out of earshot. The most unsettling part was that there was no one else around. We were miles away from the nearest town, and the lake was surrounded by sheer cliffs. One of my friends decided to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight and walked to the edge of the water, shining the beam across the lake. We followed him, our own lights illuminating the still surface. For a moment we saw nothing. Then something moved. A pale figure emerged from the water, its features obscured by the ripples. It didn't look human. It was too thin, its limbs too long. It stood there, waist deep in the lake, staring at us with empty eyes. We bolted back to the campsite, too terrified to look back. The whispers followed us, growing louder as we packed up our gear in a frenzy. As we ran toward the trailhead, I glanced back one last time. The figure was standing on the shore, watching us leave. I haven't been back to that lake since. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear those whispers calling me back. Story 3. The Phantom Hiker. I love hiking alone. There's something peaceful about being out in nature with no one around. But after what happened last summer, I'll never go camping by myself again. I had set up camp near a trail that was supposed to be lightly traveled. The first day was uneventful, and I spent the evening reading by the fire before turning in early. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. I froze listening. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. They circled my tent once, then stopped. I held my breath, waiting for whoever, or whatever, it was to leave. After a few minutes, the forest went silent again. The next morning, I found boot prints in the dirt, but no sign of anyone nearby. I told myself it was probably just another hiker passing through and decided to stay another night. That was a mistake. The footsteps returned, but this time they were accompanied by a voice. A man's voice, low and gravelly, muttering words I couldn't understand. My heart raced as I grabbed my knife and flashlight, ready to defend myself. But when I unzipped the tent and shone the light outside, there was no one there. The voice continued, coming from deeper in the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed it, flashlight trembling in my hand. I didn't get far before I saw him. A man in old hiking gear, standing motionless in the trees. His face was obscured by shadow, but his head turned slowly toward me. I ran back to my tent, grabbed my gear, and left that night. I don't know who or what that man was, but I've heard stories from other hikers about that phantom hiker. A ghost said to haunt the trails, searching for lost souls to join him. Story 4. The Forgotten Campground. We found the old campground by accident, hidden deep in the woods. The sign at the entrance was weathered and barely legible, but we were tired and decided to set up camp there anyway. The place had a strange vibe. The picnic tables were rotting and the fire pits were overgrown with weeds. It looked like no one had been there in years. But what struck us most was the silence. No birds, no insects, just an eerie, oppressive quiet. That night, as we sat around the fire, we heard it, the faint sound of children laughing. It was distant at first, but it grew closer, echoing through the trees. We couldn't see anything, but the laughter surrounded us, chilling us to the bone. Then we saw them, shadows flitting between the trees, too small to be adults. They moved quickly, almost playfully, but there was something unnatural about the way they darted through the darkness. One of my friends shouted, "Who's there?" The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, guttural growl. We ran to our tents and stayed there until morning. When we emerged, we found small handprints on the outside of each tent, pressed into the dew-covered fabric. Needless to say, we packed up and left immediately. Story 5. The Thing in the Cave. On our last camping trip, we decided to explore a nearby cave. It wasn't marked on any maps, but we thought it would be fun to check out. The entrance was small, barely wide enough to crawl through, but it opened into a massive cavern. As we ventured deeper, the air grew colder and our voices echoed strangely. Then we heard it, a faint clicking sound like stones tapping together. It grew louder as we moved deeper into the cave. We found a small chamber filled with bones, animal bones mostly, but some looked disturbingly human. That's when we saw the eyes. Two glowing orbs reflecting our flashlight beams, low to the ground. Before we could react, something moved, fast. It was humanoid but impossibly thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. It let out a guttural screech and charged at us on all fours. We didn't stop running until we were back at camp, and even then we didn't feel safe. We left everything behind and didn't stop driving until we were miles away. None of us ever spoke about what we saw in that cave, but the nightmares still haunt me.